Thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers here at HamXpo for inviting me to do the keynote, because frankly, when I was asked, I didn't hesitate at all because I had an idea of what I wanted to talk about, and I think this is a really good venue to do that. So we'll see if all the technology works here when I get this going. But I want to talk a little bit about our amateur radio community today. And before I get started, I want to talk about a little side note. And you'll have to bear with me, I promise this is relevant. And it's about social engineering. Has anybody ever heard of that before, social engineering? Yeah. Right, okay, so I had not up until 2008. Amazing event, yes. It's an absolutely amazing event. Very, very core amateur radio stuff going on there too. All about makers, creators, artists, people doing really cool things. And besides having, building stuff and, having all kinds of, workshops where you could build kits and do things like that, besides all of that, they also talked about, I was doing a presentation, and after I finished, I caught the tail end of a presentation they did about social engineering. And it really I always think of engineering as something mechanical or electrical, and I thought, what is this stuff? Well, at its core, social engineering is about getting people to say yes, right? Getting them to help you with stuff. And sure, it can be used in negative ways. Scammers use social engineering, I guess you could say, to convince people, confidence tricksters, things like that. But by and large, what really people use social engineering for, and we use every day, is to just connect with people. And it's about that connection and understanding people and meeting them where they are and creating trust. And I've got this buddy whose name I won't mention because he's really well known in the hacker community. And I would say he's really adept at social engineering. So much so that when I'm talking with him, I'm often thinking like, wait, is he doing this to me right now? Like, I'm agreeing to all this stuff because he's really good at getting people to help him do things. It's rarely for him, it's usually for his family, friends, and the many, many charities and organizations that he works with. And he sees the world as a series of open doors for him. And it's amazing to watch him at work. He does such a phenomenal job. And he's also one of the kindest people I know. And I asked him one time, I said, so I understand what social engineering is now, and I know that you're really good at it. What's the secret sauce? And he said, the secret sauce is kindness. And he said, just being kind to people. And he gave me a few examples of recent things he had done. And he said that usually the person that you're in front of, they want to be treated kindly. And when you treat them kindly, they're willing to help you with things. And so being kindness opens doors. It just does. And in fact, it's just about people skills as well. That's really what social engineering is all about. So if you are already tired of the keynote, the nutshell is to be kind. But if you leave, I can't promise that you'll win the door, okay? So just keep that in mind. So I thought one of the things I'd start talking about a little bit is something that personally I love hearing about. Being on one of the crew on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, I get to listen to this all the time when we interview someone, and that's usually finding out how they started in amateur radio. I love hearing people's stories about how they got started. Sometimes it's like an aunt or an uncle who was an electronics engineer and was an amateur radio operator, a neighbor, someone went to a library and found a QST lying on the shelf or something, or just something like that happened to introduce them. For me, it wasn't that. My introduction to amateur radio was this television set. This is a Curtis Mathis floor model. It weighed so much, I think it had its own gravity and everything. And this was our TV. This is not the actual photo of it. This is our TV when I was in high school. And it broke, and we needed it to be repaired. And back then, Curtis Mathis would actually send a human being to your house to fix it. I think they're probably one of the last companies that ever did that. And my parents couldn't be there that day when the repair guy came, and they said, hey, can you hang around the house? And I did. And he showed up, and of course this thing's so massive that all we could do is move it away from like the corner of the living room. And he got back there, and I kind of held the flashlight for him. And I was looking back there asking him questions about every single component in that TV, and I'm sure he was like, what is this guy? Come on, just hold the flashlight. But he turned to me at one point and he said, hang on, have you ever heard of amateur radio? And I said, well, I'm a shortwave radio listener, and I have been since I was 8. So I've heard amateur radio on the bands, but I don't really know that much about it. And so I took him in my bedroom and showed him this Zenith Transoceanic, which was one that my great aunt had given me. And it's how I tuned in the world. I had a little listening post and everything. And he said, oh my gosh, you have got to learn about amateur radio. You'll really love this stuff. And what he stressed was 2 things that really caught my attention. Number one was that I could actually get on the air and be on the shortwaves, and I thought that sounded really cool. The second thing was, he said, it is much more than a hobby, it's a global community. And he said, no matter where you go in the world, when you're an amateur radio operator, you're gonna have friends there. And of course, he was on the clock. He had other things to do that day. But he told me how to get licensed. And he just said, go over to the Radio Shack. There was one I could almost walk to from the house. And I was there all the time anyway. And he said, pick up a Gordon West novice exam packet. And this was back in probably like 1989. And so I did that like very next day. I picked it up. I started reading the book. And I wanted to get my license, but I was also a senior in high school. I had finals coming up. I worked all summer and then went to college, and then college started, and I moved to France for a year. I had all this stuff going on, and I just never sat down and did all of the study because I felt like it would be taking away from all these other things I needed to do. I needed to make good grades, right? So as soon as I graduated in 1996, I moved to Athens, Ohio, because my wife was doing her MFA in film there. And I was looking for a job, and the only job I could find was at a Radio Shack. And I know, right? And that job taught me a lot of things. I had a good time, met a lot of really cool people. It also taught me that I'm not good at retail sales. Like, that's just not my thing. I did the opposite of what the other salespeople did. If you ever remember going to a Radio Shack, if you were looking at TVs, computers, stereo components, things like that, you would be attacked by a salesperson. But if you went to the back of the store and you were looking for inductors and transistors and things like that, you may be out there for a while. And a lot of it was because those parts had like almost no commission on them at all. But I didn't care because I thought the most interesting people that came in the store went to the back of the store, right? And one day, this fellow named Mike, his call sign at the time was AAADB. Today it's K8RAT. A wonderful guy. He came back and he was doing a project, and I asked him, I was like, what is this stuff? Because I was helping him find all these little components. And he said, it's for an amateur radio thing I'm working on. And I was like, oh, amateur radio, like in 2 weeks I'm taking my exam. And he said, oh, well, in that case, here's how you need to come to our amateur radio club meeting at the Athens County Amateur Radio Club. And this weekend, you need to come out to the Athens Fairground because we're doing FYBO. And I said, what's FYBO? And he said, freeze your butt off. And I was like, and this is radio related? And he said, yeah, just come on out, come on out. And so that weekend, I went there and found Mike. This is an actual photo from that day. And I found Mike there in front of these radios. And in my head, because I've been reading QST and other magazines, CQ and stuff, I really thought of amateur radio as having like really big gear for some reason. And all these really small components. And it turns out it was a QRP event where you have a contest that still exists today, and you get multipliers for how cold it is. And that day they got a lot of multipliers. It was really cold and very windy. But I was hearing Morse code coming out, and they were doing Morse code, and I was absolutely fascinated with gear. Mike got up, he showed me all around, he introduced me to a few people, and then he introduced me to Eric, WD8RIF. I didn't know at the time But these two guys would become some of my closest friends. And it all started that day, my very first day doing anything amateur radio. These two people are some of my very closest friends today. And what's so amazing about it was when I was planning to get licensed, I remember talking to my college roommate. I'm like, yeah, I'm studying for my amateur radio exam. And he said, who are you going to talk to? Like, what do you have in common with them? You know what an amateur radio operator is. And I think he painted a picture of like an older couple from Florida with a huge Cadillac and two poodles on leashes. And he was like, what do you have in common with them? And I was like, well, I don't know. I still want to do this. But I found out, yeah, I mean, there's everybody here. We're a very diverse group of people, and that's what makes us so cool. And turns out that friendship is one of the common denominators in my whole amateur radio experience. Another one is my love of radio. And Eric had this Index Labs QRP Plus. I was just speaking to someone here before about this radio. It's such a cool little radio, and I couldn't believe the size of it and the fact that they were communicating with people like all over the country and the continent in this little contest, all with 5 watts of power. It just blew my mind. So much so that I'm pretty sure that I became addicted to radios, and today this is my version of it. I've still got one of these that I purchased, and I love how it takes me back to my very first day learning about amateur radio, really. And I honestly not only collect radios, but I would say I'm a little bit of an enabler for other people to find radios too. Some of you in the room are like, yep. My name's a curse word in a lot of houses. But it's all about making friends. And on the flight over here, I had a crazy flight. Instead of flying into Logan, I flew into Worcester, if I'm saying that correctly, Worcester. And I actually like that airport. But from Philadelphia to Worcester, we had a really long delay. They replaced the front 2 tires on it, and I was happy that they were taking their time doing it correctly. And I sat in the plane for quite a while. After we got in, we had to get more fuel, and that took like 45 minutes. We were sitting in the plane, and I was on my phone, and I was looking at my contacts, and I thought, I've never organized my contacts on the phone. So I created like a group called All Contacts, then one called Ham Radio Operators, and then another one called Friends. And I started loading it up, and I realized that I didn't have many to put in the Ham Radio Operators category because they were all in the Friends category. And when I look at my closest friends today, they're amateur radio operators. So the guy was right about building community, and he was also right, my very first amateur radio operator I met was also right about it being a global community, because I've traveled a lot, I've lived in other countries, and amateur radio has opened the door. I remember once having a really awkward meeting with 2 guys that were engineers at a company I worked for, and I was sort of in the eastern part of Germany, and we just didn't have a lot to talk about. And they were kind of quiet, but somehow amateur radio came up, and then they were like, "You're an amateur radio operator?" I was like, "Yeah," and they immediately were inviting me to their house. I mean, it's just like a total change in everything. You guys see my gear? We got to do stuff. And it's true that everywhere you go, when you travel the world, there's going to be someone there, and it's almost like instant family. And I love that. And I kind of wonder, what makes us different than other hobbies, other communities, and other things? Because I have 2 neighbors that we love. They're almost like an extra great aunt and uncle to our kids, Linda and George. Linda is a quilter. George is a folk music. He does folk music. Both of them have really strong communities around quilting and folk music with conventions and everything. But even their communities are not as global and not as connected as ours. And I was thinking, why is that? Well, we're communicators. Even people who come into amateur radio for the technical side of things, we have some aspect of wanting to communicate with other people. Even if you're like me and you're kind of introverted, right? You still want to communicate and connect with people. And I would say, I agree with people when they say that we're the original global social network. And I would say that we've stood the test of time because we don't always follow the way that social media does now, the same dynamics it has. Because social media, it has some great things, right? Like some of the pros are you have instant global reach with it. It's easy to share ideas and experiences, to discover like-minded communities really quickly. I've been using it recently because I have a Brompton folding bike, which is like a little British folding bike. And there's no one around me that knows how to maintenance these, so I, through social media, can get into communities where people can help guide me when I need to do things like work on the gear shifter and all that stuff. Low barrier of entry, basically anyone can join. It's great for learning and getting exposure to new interests, but it has some cons. And I would say these cons actually come at a great cost. Number one, and probably the most important, is they are typically built on algorithms, right? And these algorithms divide us. They make us angry with each other, and I hate that part of social media. I really do. It's one of the reasons why, if anything, I'm kind of a user of social media. I read a lot, but I don't really interact a whole lot on social media because of that. There are exceptions to this, but those algorithms are designed to really kind of focus people on paying attention to the content they want you to see because that makes money. And it can create shallow and kind of just temporary connections with people. They can be echo chambers that replace real people talking with each other, right? And the quantity of the followers is often a metric of quality of relationship in social media. And it's easy to hide behind anonymity, and I think that leads to hostility a lot. It leads to a lot of trolling, and I don't like that. I don't like how fertile the grounds are for trolling. But amateur radio, I'm not saying that we're perfect, but we have like real voice-to-voice, key-to-voice. Even digital contacts, they tend to be more human-based. And they're built on mentorship, community, and kindness instead of algorithms. That's our algorithm, is kindness. Diversity of ages, especially, and cultures. And people will often say, when they have the idea of what an amateur radio is, it's like an older white guy or something. But if you look globally in amateur radio, it's a slice of everyone. It really is. And we get to strengthen our skill levels together. We have a shared spirit of helping each other, right? Elmering. It's built into the fabric of who we are. And it's a community where kindness is the currency, and respect sustains the network over time. And this is the one thing I've heard a lot of people talk about, or like licensing, and people who are kind of interested in amateur radio, but they don't really want to do the licensing part. And they say, well, why do you have to have that barrier of entry? And I think there are a lot of practical reasons, right? Like we deal with equipment that could give you RF burns, that you could use inappropriately. And I think that it makes sense, of course, having licensing. But I would really argue that getting licensed isn't about being exclusive. It's not a barrier. It's really about stepping into a community with purpose. And I think that actually is I think it's a positive. And so strengthening our community, how we do that? Well, the first thing that we do is we welcome everyone, regardless of their age, their background, anything, just welcome everyone. And I was able to, and as like a small example of this, my daughters were homeschooled. They weren't initially homeschooled. We never intended to homeschool them. But in kindergarten, we learned just how bad their dyslexia was. And the public school teacher said, look, we just don't have the resources for this. They suggested we go to a private school that we could not afford for two girls, not if we ever planned to do anything else in life. And so what we did was we hired tutors for them, and we got very involved with homeschool cooperatives that are in the Asheville area where I live. And those were actually really amazing. Some of the parents and some of the teachers that we hired were really amazing because we wanted our girls to get the real classroom experience. One of the cooperatives we belonged to, when my daughters were, I think, probably in 7th grade, they were looking for high school curriculum for the following term, which would have been the fall term. And at the end of the spring term, all the parents got together and we were talking about different things they wanted to do. And they asked me, hey, would you be willing to teach French again or geography or one of those things? And I said, no, I kind of want to teach amateur radio. And they were looking at me like, what? And I said, no, hear me out. Like, it's really good. Like, the curriculum, when we finish with this course in one term, your kids will not even look at a Wi-Fi router the same way. They won't look at their phone the same way. And I said, plus it meets a STEM requirement for high school. And you could tell they were starting to nod a little bit, but they also were trying to think like, how can we let Thomas down? And then I pulled the secret sauce of making it work, as I said, by the way, your kids are sophomores and juniors. If they get their license, which I'll help them get their license in one term, if they get their license, it opens the door to hundreds of scholarships other people can't apply for. And they were like, so we're doing amateur radio this one term. It had them, that was it. Just keep that in mind if you ever have to pitch it. That was wonderful. And the funny thing was, when I did this course, I'd never taught anything like this. I used the ARRL Red Book that's spiral bound as our course material. And they did a lot of the theory and a lot of the practice at home. These are really smart kids, like to learn everything. They would bring their questions in, we'd go over them. But the main thing we did in person during our 2-hour class is I just did stuff. I had them build things, I had them experiment with things, work a little bit of coding, and I would take them out to the field like we did this day. And I should say that in this class, I think it was 8 students, 7 were young women, and there was 1 young man in the class. And we went out, we set up the radio. I purposely got separate radios, separate SWR meters, separate batteries so they could see all the components that go into a system. And then they were like, well, don't we have to have an antenna? I was like, yeah, we've got to make the antenna. And so I brought wire and some window line, and we just made a doublet and put it in a tree. The very first contact they made with the antenna they just built was a fellow in Slovenia. And they were hooked. And they were like, wow, this is so cool how this is happening, right? And so I do think that it's really important to focus on youth. But we don't want to lose sight of other age groups either, because I would say that one of the fastest growing age groups that come into our hobby are the youth of retirement, right? They're the people who are just recently retired and they've got time to do this now. And some of the most avid POTA and SOTA operators I know, the activators, are all people in this category. Like they always were interested in amateur radio, but they had no really good excuse for doing it until after they retired. And now they're like on mountains and in parks everywhere, and they're doing CW way faster and better than I do, and it's just amazing to see. So keep in mind, we should be welcoming everybody into this. By the way, this is my buddy Vlado, N3CZ, and this was during national parks on the air. And Morse code is one of those things that brings everybody around to your table when you're out there playing. So if you're ever doing POTA or SOTA, or IOTA or any of those on-the-air activities in a public space, always be willing to set your stuff aside and talk to people about what you're doing. Because first of all, they're gonna think you're a spy or you're talking to aliens. And you need to clear that up really quickly, right? I mean, how bad of a spy would you be if that was your gig, right? But what we need to do for our community is to be radically kind, right? Kindness isn't just about a nice to have, really. It's a strategy for growth and retention in our amateur radio community. And like one kind word can lead to a lifetime of experiences in our community. I don't even like calling amateur radio a hobby. I feel like it's just not a good enough word for amateur radio. You know, I want to call it a community of people because that's exactly what we are, a community and a network of people. And radical kindness, by that I just mean that you go out of your way to be kind, even sometimes when there's a little friction, right? It's not a nice to have. It costs us nothing. Kindness costs us nothing at all. But it can be worth a lifetime of connections. Also, be radically empathetic. I think that empathy is one of our best human qualities. I think amateur radio operators are really good at this too, right? So when you're with people and you're at a club meeting and you see somebody walk in, imagine being in their shoes, what they would want. And they would probably want someone to introduce them to people. They would want to be brought into the community, and that's what we should be doing. Right? When we're on the air and we're talking to a new operator, we should slow down for them. Even voice, but especially Morse code. Just match them where they are. I always think about it this way, like even with empathy, is when my daughters were 4 and I needed to give them a message that they needed to pay attention to, right? Like, stop doing this. What I would do is I would get down on my knees and talk to them because I'd be on their level. And I think that is what we do when we're empathetic, and we're radically empathetic. It bridges cultures, it bridges ages, it bridges everything. It puts us all on the same level. I remember actually my first field day with ACARA, with the Athens County Amateur Radio Club. I was really excited about it. I had read about field day before. I didn't really know what to expect. And the club really wanted to make a good effort in the QRP category that they were in. And they wanted to place in it. They just wanted to do it that year. And so I knew there was pressure to make a lot of contacts. But we went out to the field, and all the other operators were eager to just get me on the air. I don't think they had a GOTA station back then. But they were like, here, Tom, get on the air. Here's how you do it. And they helped me, even though it was slowing them down. And they probably weren't making as many contacts as they could have. They knew, and they could read from me, that I really wanted to be on the air. And that's what we should be doing, is reaching out and kind of doing that. And also, just making yourself available, right? And it doesn't just mean like hours and hours of your time. Sometimes it's just a quick answer to something, or just acknowledging someone, even on the air or in person, and helping install an antenna, helping someone set up their radio for the first time. Just make yourself available. And that builds mentorship or Elmering, right? And I really think that's the backbone of amateur radio. And the other thing is just sort of like this, is just being there, right? Show up. It's kind of the most powerful thing you can do in amateur radio. And it's not just, I think the most powerful thing is not running a kilowatt. It's just kind of being there for your fellow amateur radio operators. And don't assume that what you have to offer is something that someone doesn't want, right? And sort of a case in point with this, talking just about that particular class that I taught that time. If you don't recognize this radio, this is an ALT 512. Does anybody recognize this? Just a couple people here. The reason why is I had this radio on loan, and I was doing a review of it for RADCOM, for RSGB. And it was a really cool little radio, but unfortunately, weeks after my review posted in print, the developer in Bulgaria passed away, and so the radio just kind of fizzled out, right? But it was a really neat little radio, and I thought this will be a great way to test the digital modes on it, because I needed to do that yet for my review. So I took it to the class that I was teaching, and by be there, I mean, in my head I was thinking, will they really enjoy this? Will they really enjoy the digital mode stuff? Because it's not as interactive as talking to somebody in Slovenia, and I'd set the bar kind of high already. So I thought, I'm just going to show up, I'm just going to be there, I'm just going to bring my stuff there, and we'll just see what happens. And I planned to take the radio outdoors and make another antenna, but like the heavens opened that day, and during our 2-hour window it was just pouring rain outside. So instead we set up in the classroom, this big brick building, and I was smart enough to bring a little magnetic loop antenna with me. It was in the car. And so I set it in a window next to this room. You can't see it, but on the left it's sitting in a window. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use this digital mode, and I explained how it worked, and I said, we're going to see how many miles per watt that we can get off of each contact, because that radio runs 5 watts. And so I had one person who was actually operating the FT8 program. I had other people who were looking at people in QRZ to get their coordinates, another person who was figuring out the distance, and then Gia here, who's at the board, she was finishing off the calculations and writing what was the best miles per watt that we had gotten. And everybody was engaged, everybody was really excited every time we made a contact, just so they could see how much further we had gotten. And here's the funny thing. Gia over there by the whiteboard, her mom was one of the people. By the way, everybody in my class got their amateur radio license at the end. They all passed the test. I wasn't at all surprised. they're very bright, and they were really enjoying it, and so they made it happen. And her mom, though, came to me after the class, and she said, I'm going to tell you something. When you proposed that whole amateur radio thing, I was completely against it. And then when they decided to do it anyway, she said, I still was thinking about asking my daughter just to sit out that class and use it as like a study session time or something like that. She said, but Gia said, yeah, I still want to go to it. And she came to it, and she said by week 2, it was her favorite class she'd ever taken. And it turns out she had a thing for electronics. And she said that year at Christmas, instead of asking for clothes, she wanted an Arduino set. and so just by being there, I didn't focus on her trying to get her interested in amateur radio, just making myself present, making amateur radio present. It brought somebody else into the hobby, and it actually changed the course of everything she wanted to study in college. And just by being there. So again, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that the backbones of amateur radio really are based around empathy. Where we choose to be radically empathetic, we offer our presence of heart. We take the time to hear a nervous new operator, to work with someone who's new to the hobby and bring them in and show them that we're all family here, right? Just by being present and being available, even in small ways, we show our presence of time. And maybe it's just answering a quick question, maybe it's helping somebody set up something for the first time, but we're there for them. And then when we are there constantly and reliably, not devoting our whole lives to it, but just being available, we offer a presence of community. And that's actually one of the things that is amazing about this. I realized when I was putting together this presentation, I was like, I'm going to be preaching to the choir here, because this is what Ham Expo is all about. You're here because you want to connect with your community. You want to learn new things. You want to meet people. You want to have a really good time. You know, that's what you're here for. And above all, we need to be kind. And I have to say, when I look at the news, when I look at things today, it feels like this is a natural resource that's going away sometimes. And it really saddens me because I feel like it's almost counterculture. But kindness is like one of the most human, most important things that we can do in the amateur radio community. And when we're kind, we will build a really strong amateur radio community. So if you just keep that simple message, be kind, then we can ensure that amateur radio doesn't just remain a hobby, but it's a community that welcomes, sustains, and inspires people for generations to come. Thank you.
Okay, now, the first thing we're going to try to do is figure out how to bring the lights up a little bit.